Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we'll be discussing the Rambam Hilchos Milah, Peri Gimel, Halacha Gimel. The Rambam talks about the mitzvah of Milah, and he talks about the brachas that you say for a bris, and he concludes the Halacha Gimel, V'avi haben mevarach Shehecheyanu, that the father of the child says the bracha of Shehecheyanu. This is the Rambam Shita. However, other Rishonim disagree. Taisvus and Sukkah, Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph, says clearly that you do not say Shehecheyanu. The father does not say Shehecheyanu by a bris. What's the crux of the argument? So it seems that the argument here is when you say Shehecheyanu for a mitzvah that comes mizman lizman, is the Shehecheyanu said because you did a mitzvah? The fact that you didn't have any pleasure from doing the mitzvah, any physical pleasure, doesn't detract from the fact that you did the mitzvah? Or does it come from the fact that there is a simcha in that mitzvah? There is a gashmisdika simcha. And that's what seems from Taisvus and Sukkah, that that's the geder of Shehecheyanu. And therefore, by a bris, there is no simcha gashmius. The baby was already born, so this is not for the birth of the baby. But the Rekeach explains Taisvus even more. He says, by a pidyon haben, there's also no simcha gashmius, l'cheira, but there is Shehecheyanu there. Why? Because at 30 days, when you do a pidyon haben, kol lechadash, if you know for sure that this child is not a preemie, the child has gestated fully and will be a viable child. So that's the simcha gashmius. So it's, and the same thing with the other mitzvahs that you make Shehecheyanu, it's because it's a time of simcha, a time of yontif. So there has to be a simcha gashmius. That's the shita that holds that you do not say Shehecheyanu by a bris because there is no simcha gashmius. However, the Rambam disagrees with that premise. The Rambam holds that the fact that you're doing the mitzvah itself, it's a mitzvah that comes mizman lizman, that itself requires the saying of Shehecheyanu. The fact the other shittas hold that there's no simcha, even though there can be a simcha, a person can be satisfied and happy that he did a mitzvah. So the Gemara says mitzvahs lav lahenis nitnu. Mitzvahs are not given for the pleasure, for the pleasure of doing the mitzvah. Rashi adds the words el la'ol nitnu, are given as a yoke. So the simcha that you get from doing a mitzvah doesn't count for the saying of Shehecheyanu, according to the other shittas. According to the Rambam, you don't need simcha. The fact itself that you did a mitzvah, mizman lizman, requires Shehecheyanu. That would be the shita of the Rambam. Now, the Haggadas Maimonides on the location over here, and in other places, Taisvus and Eruvin, say that the reason why you don't say Shehecheyanu for a bris, those who disagree with the Rambam, it's because of tzara diyanuka, because the baby is in tsar, is in pain. And the Gemara in Ksubas talks about you don't say the blessing simcha b'ma'inai because of the pain of the baby, the bris. So the same thing over here, you wouldn't say Shehecheyanu. So the Rambam has a raya that that's not true. It doesn't apply to the Shehecheyanu. Why? Because there's a Gemara in Brachas that if a person loses a parent, a father, he has to say the bracha dayin ha'emes when you lose a close relative, but you also say the bracha of Shehecheyanu because of the Yerusha. So you see that even though there's definitely tsar there, there's definitely pain, nevertheless, you still say Shehecheyanu because you have a reason for celebration as well, though it's tempered by the loss of the father. But so in other words, the Shehecheyanu doesn't depend on your matzav haruach. It depends on whether you do a mitzvah. This ties in with what we said before. As long as the mitzvah is done, you make Shehecheyanu on the mitzvah, not on the simcha. Because if it's a simcha, you could argue, what kind of simcha is it? It's a tempered simcha. It's a mitigated simcha. And the person is not going to go singing and dancing because of the Yerusha when he lost his father. So the Rambam says that that's not a chasaron. Why? Because the ikar thing is the kiyum ha-mitzvah. That itself requires Shehecheyanu. And the Rambam's raya is very strong from the case of Yerusha, because over there, they get an argument, you could say, that the simcha is tempered because of the tsar. Because it's the same cause of the tsar, it's the cause of the simcha. The simcha is caused by the loss of the father and the tsar. So one, you could say, mitigates the other. But over here, when you're talking about the case of Milah, the tsar is the baby and the mitzvah that you did. So if in the case where the one is connected with the other and you still say Shehecheyanu, even though one tsar dampens one's simcha, certainly when there are two separate aspects over here. One is the tsar of the Yanuka, and one is your Kiyum HaMitzvah. So there should certainly be Shehecheyanu. And moreover, in the case of the Yerusha, we're talking about Shehecheyanu, it's a Simcha Gashmias, and the Tsar is a Tsar Gashmi. So it's arguable that one detracts from the other. Mashe'en Kain, when you're talking about the Milah, the Tsar is a physical Tsar of the Yanuka. The Kiyum HaMitzvah is a spiritual Simcha. It's a Kiyum HaMitzvah. You'd say one doesn't detract from the other. So it should certainly be a reason to say Shehecheyanu. So that's the Rambam's Raya. But now the Rambam itself, there's the two shittas in the Rambam. There are some Rishonim who learn, Rachreinim, who learn that the Rambam holds that the father says Shehecheyanu no matter who does the bris itself, whether the father does it or Moel does it. But there are other Rishonim who hold that the Rambam is only talking about if the father himself does the bris. And they base this on the Rambam in Hilchos Brachos. So the question is, what is the understanding of that shita of the Rambam? Why only when the father himself does it? So based on what we just said before, it makes sense, because the Rambam holds it has nothing to do with simcha itself. It has to do with the kiyum ha-mitzvah. The fact that you're doing a mitzvah, that itself warrants Shehecheyanu. And therefore, the Rambam is machalik that if your father is doing the mitzvah himself, then he has a full kiyum ha-mitzvah. If he has the full kiyum ha-mitzvah, then he can say Shehecheyanu, even though there's tzara diyanuka, because one thing has nothing to do with the other. This is a kiyum ha-mitzvah that requires Shehecheyanu, and that's a tsar that doesn't need Shehecheyanu. But what does one detract from the other? Just because you're not able to have the simcha doesn't mean you don't do a mitzvah. And kiyum ha-mitzvah requires Shehecheyanu. Now the Aguda says something that tzarech iyun. The Aguda says that he learns like the shita that says that the Rambam holds that only if the father does the mitzvah does he say Shehecheyanu. And the reason he says, well, the father doesn't say Shehecheyanu when he's not doing the mitzvah, so he says because tzara diyanuka. So he agrees with the svara of tzara diyanuka. So then the question is, then why, when the father himself does it, we don't care about tzara diyanuka? So the answer is, if you're doing it mitzad the simcha of the mitzvah, the father has simcha whether he does it himself or whether it's done by a male. He has the simcha that his child entered in l'chnisa bebrisa shel Avram Avinu. And regardless, he says the bracha l'chnisa bebrisa shel Avram Avinu. So in other words, there's a simcha mitzad the kiyum ha-mitzvah. But that simcha, you could say, is disrupted because tzara diyanuka. Because it's not the kiyum ha-mitzvah himself that brings him the Shehecheyanu, it's the simcha that the mitzvah was done. So there you could say tzara diyanuka takes away from that simcha. Mashe'en Kain, when the father himself does it, it's the kiyum ha-mitzvah that you do yourself, that warrants Shehecheyanu. That's the shittas Harambam. Tzara diyanuka has no effect on it because it's two separate, two totally independent things. The halacha, among Sephardim, many Sephardim do say Shehecheyanu. Shehecheyanu and Ashkenazim, we follow the shittas Rishonim that say you do not say Shehecheyanu for the bris.